Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyards when we're listening through the whole Bible in a year. My name is Bern, Leckie. I'm joined by Owen, Lynch.
Hello.
And we are continuing our journey this week through the prophet Isaiah, which is quite an amazing journey. Last time we were talking about some of this and some of the things Isaiah was saying that sounded amazing but kind of too good to be true. And it got me thinking, like, actually, just how amazing is it in general that we can hear from God? Let's just take that in for a moment. This is a big idea. This is a big, bold idea. People can genuinely hear from a real, genuine, the creator of the universe, God. Now, I don't know about you. I still remember a time when I had a conversation with Kelly Clarkson, and I was quite excited about that for years later.
Kelly Clarkson.
Yeah, she's really nice. We prayed together as well. That was fun. But yes, interestingly, yeah, I remember the Kelly Clarkson bit, and then I remember, and we chatted with God. Isn't it amazing that we can talk to God and hear from God? What do you think, though? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's it sounds like you're a crackpot. It sounds like you're kind of off with the fairies a little bit, but on the other hand, when we realise that most people in their life reach out and pray, most people reach out and pray to a higher power, and many people think that God has spoken to them. It doesn't actually sound so crackpot at all. It sounds actually quite mainstream. And this idea, I think, that we can hear from God is, I think a lot of people would go, whether they have any religion or not, would say, okay, fair enough. Yeah, why not? I mean, it's a highly subjective thing, of course. It's a highly personal thing. But I don't know about you, but whenever I feel like God has spoken to me, whether through a dream or a sense of circumstance, perhaps falling in a way, or perhaps even just perhaps through an inspired reading of the Bible or something else, it could be anything. It could be through a person. I've had an incredible a deep sense of, I'm gonna that's such an encouragement to me. I'm owning that, whether it sounds crazy or not. What about you?
Yeah, I think I feel a mix of feelings about the idea of sort of hearing God for real. Like, how do you know it's for real? How do you know what is really God, and how do you know what is just my imagination? Hearing really God is going to feel like my own thoughts. It's going to feel like my imagination anyway. So how do I tell the difference?
Yeah, right.
Actually, I think this is one of the things that Isaiah is really, really helpfully, although in a difficult circumstance, really helpfully pointing the way to. Because a lot of what Isaiah is saying, especially in the middle of Isaiah, that we've been listening to this week, is about the differences between what happens when people kind of create their own idea of God, or take a thing that they think sounds a little bit God-ish and then turn it into their own things, and the difference in life between doing that and making a real connection with the real God. And if God is real, I think it would seem sensible to me that God would really think it's important for us to know how real He is and what it looks like to be really hearing from Him. And I think that is covered a lot in these chapters from Isaiah.
And what have you listened to this week where that's kind of impacted you, Ben?
Well, starting with chapter 28. You've got this description that Isaiah brings up about religious people, about priests and prophets that have been sort of corrupted somehow. They're doing their own thing instead of really, really faithfully passing on what they've got from God. Verse 7, priests and prophets stagger from beer and befuddled from wine. So then the word of the Lord to them will become, do this, do that, a rule for this, a rule for that. A little here, a little there. Now, that might have been Isaiah talking about rules, religious rules, but actually the way it sounds in Hebrew, it has a sort of effect of, it will just sound like blah, 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 blah. He could just be saying it sounds nonsense. And so they take the thing that looks like they're doing the religious stuff hey everybody, we come up with lots of rules to follow, but the way they've put it into practice, it's just nonsense. And so, Isaiah says, as they go, they will fall. They'll fall backwards. They'll be injured. They'll be snared and captured. And I think what Isaiah is saying is that this religious thing that you think you're doing well, all these rules that you think that you've carefully constructed, or all these ideas that you've got about how you think it's going to work, it's been corrupted. And so it's not going to work because you missed the point. And we talked a lot about what the point was and how you could know that you hadn't missed the point last time, didn't we?
Absolutely.
Last time, particularly, Isaiah's words were about social justice. That you could tell, if you could see minorities suffering, you could tell if people were being oppressed, if rich people were doing much better than poor people, and poor people were starving, and you weren't respecting immigrants, and you weren't putting the same sort of value on people that God places on them. Well, your religion had gone wrong and God didn't want it anymore, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that much is clear from Isaiah, and actually it resonates very much with the story that we've been listening to all the way through the year, really, hasn't it?
Absolutely, yes. But the good news as well that we heard from Isaiah last week, which carries on this week, is there is a better way. There's a way forward. You don't have to keep messing it up, because it does sound like quite a big ask, to be honest, to distinguish our own ideas from God from the real God. So how is God going to do that? One of the ways that Isaiah communicates that, I think, is by making contrasts between the ways of life that people thought were sensible and the things that people were doing, and contrasting that with the way that God wanted them to go on. And then giving some very specific promises about what this way would look like. So one of the contrasts Isaiah makes is, says people had entered into religiously looking things that just weren't from God at all. We've entered into a covenant with death. With the realm of the dead, we have made an agreement, Isaiah quotes. Well, that doesn't sound anything like anything from the rest of the Bible that we've looked at, right? It doesn't sound anything like what Yahweh had given to his people. What that sounds a lot like is other people's religions. It sounds like the whole point of their religion was to avoid death or to avoid suffering and enter into death in a good state, something like that. And sometimes I think we think that's what religion's about. It's about your ticket to heaven or something like that. This is not God's idea at all. Isaiah couldn't be any clearer. Isaiah says instead, I lay a stone in Zion, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line.
Those old chestnuts again.
I know. So Isaiah's just saying, don't do this religious flavoured nonsense where it's all about death and avoiding death or having a nice thing after you die. Go for justice in life, social justice. That's what Isaiah's describing as the measuring line. That's how we know we're being faithful and aligned with God's values. Isaiah was just talking to people who had forgotten all of that.
And Bern, I do think, and forgive me, you may disagree with me, but I do think that those two words, justice and righteousness, which we mean righteousness is about right living. It's about living in a way that lives in a way that kind of blesses your neighbor rather than hinders your neighbor, so to speak. It's about living in ways that bring life rather than death. And I think that those two words, righteousness and justice, I think they're more to do with our political institutions than they are our religious institutions. I don't know if that's because our religious institutions have just kind of so far off track that it's hard to kind of see justice and righteousness in those organizations. But for me, our social order as a nation, it's built on principles of justice and righteousness, right living. And this is how we get along. This is how we live with an ordered society that is productive and fruitful for everyone. It reads more like a political manifesto from Isaiah's words, as far as I can see, than it does a religious a religious manifesto. It's about real everyday life rather than something so highfalutin and ethereal and otherworldly that it has no relevance to our lives, which to my mind is why we, as we think about this, as people who are part of a church, need to reimagine what church is. We need to rethink it, because I do think that we are guilty and perhaps even just part of a culture that has abandoned these two most important principles of justice and righteousness for the sake of something that, as you said just now, is more akin to, getting your ticket stamped and, going to heaven when you die. It just seems such a deeper and more profound way of life and a way of faith than that kind of cheap, kind of superficial alternative.
Amen. And I want more of that. I want the real thing. Wouldn't it be crazy if, like, we go through any more of our lives at all, and then someone somehow reveals to us that that there was a better version. There was a better version of faith that we could have had. There was a better version of religion than we thought was the one we were settling for.
Yeah.
That there's a better government possible than the one we've put up with for 14 years. Can you imagine that?
Sadly, I think most people in the UK might agree with you on that one, whatever your political affiliation.
Well, I'm just struck by the fact that whatever people think, and when you're listening to this, and maybe the honeymoon period is worn off for the Labour government by now. If it's more than a week past the election, that's quite possibly likely. But it's having the hope in the things that could be that is really important. And when people have lost their sense of hope, I think restoring a sense of hope is really important. Now, what Isaiah points to particularly, and this is where we need to come back to what is that hope in then? And where do we want to put our hope? Isaiah's contrasts between some of the things that do sound like kind of sensible and like common sense to us. He contrasts having our hope in physical things, protection from harm. In chapter 31, he says, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots." God is saying something particular here. He's saying, don't put all your hopes in alliances. Don't put all your hopes in strength and stuff, because those things can perish. Those things aren't as strong as they look. And I've got something better for you. Chapter 32, a king will reign in righteousness and rulers will rule with justice. This is interesting. I think this harks back to what you're saying, Owen, that it's not just like a religious thing that's there to believe in one person, even one saviour, but a promise that there will be rulers ruling with justice. That this will be a multiplying thing, that the world can hope for more and over a longer period of time than just something that happened a couple of thousand years ago. The way that it would seem sensible to people to arrange it would be through strength. But the way that Isaiah says God's going to arrange it is through weakness. And we're bringing life where it looked like there was no chance of life. Chapter 35, the burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground, bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And then we get to another one of the big quotable bits. And a highway will be there. A highway will be where? Where in particular? Is this going to be a highway? No, it's going to be there in that place where you thought no life could exist. It will be there that God brings it up. And there the highway will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about on it. And there's a promise that it's going to be protected and it's going to be full of life and joy. Doesn't that sound interesting?
It really does. And it's interesting as well because the sort of social order that you're describing there is It's kind of, it sounds a bit upside down from what our social order has been and continues to be across the world in many different forms and shapes. And I'm not talking here about political affiliations or political, kind of stripes. I'm talking here about just that heart of service. And I think what we see here is that Isaiah is saying that it's actually the heart of a servant that will change the world. It's the heart of a servant that will prevent catastrophe coming your way. And certainly as we look at the situation in chapters through to 49, I think what we've heard there is a sense of there's a turning point, that there is hope, and that hope lies in a heart of service. The suffering servant becomes a key figure in the remaining chapters of Isaiah, and we'll talk more about this in our next episode. But nevertheless, I'm struck by the fact that the way out of disaster is a heart of service. And without wanting to make a big deal out of the recent change of government here in the UK, I am struck, though, we saw a change of tack and tone, perhaps just after the election period, where the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak, both emphasised the importance of service as politicians, that their call as politicians is to serve the nation, as a servant of the nation. And of course that's true for them, but I think it's the way forwards as well that Isaiah describes as the way forwards for all people, that we are all called to serve one another, and that this value of service is at the heart of a healthy society. And I think that was true for the time of Isaiah, with the southern kingdom, Judah, Benjamin, that were facing annihilation by the Babylonians, and it's true today in our society that we only have hope if we are willing to serve one another and work for the best in one another, rather than seek the worst for each other.
Absolutely, yes. I think it's really interesting to look at how Isaiah develops that thought about service and servants, because that gets mentioned a lot in the things that we've just been listening to as well. One of the other ways of life, the ways that seem right to us, that Isaiah calls out as wrong, is making our own gods. And he describes that as like the work of a metal worker, or the one who smooths with the hammer and makes an idol and says, this is good. I think he could just as well be talking about us if we're not making one with our hands, but just crafting our own sense of God from whatever we think that is, but we're not connecting with the real God. How do we connect with the real God? Well, it really is like the service thing is how we know, it's how we recognize it. God, first of all, chapter 41, he says he calls Israel as a servant. This is like Israel as a nation. Come and be a servant. I've taken you from the ends of the earth, and I've called you. So you are my servant. I've chosen you. And so he's giving Israel collectively an important role, which still endures, I think. Then chapter 42, God localizes that. How do they know how to be a servant? What does a good servant look like? Well, here's my servant, chapter 42, verse 1. Here's my servant. It looks more like a person now. My chosen one in whom I delight. I'll put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. And also, he will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. This is a weird kind of leader. This is the servant leadership thing that probably still sounds weird to us with 2,000 years of hindsight. It sounded astonishing in the Roman world when Jesus was born into. They didn't have any concept that a servant leader was a good thing. So Isaiah's promises that God is going to call a nation to be servant and show what that's like through a person is really remarkable. But when you think about who that person was, who we believe that person to be, I think it becomes even more remarkable, because let's remember, we believe Jesus wasn't just a person. We believe Jesus is the incarnation and revelation of God himself. So this isn't God saying, you're all going to have to be faithful servants while I tell you what to do. This is God saying, I'm going to show you what servant leadership is like, because I'm going to be a servant. I'm going to serve. I'm going to suffer.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it'd be great in our next episode to explore how the certainly the early church, the group of people that gathered around Jesus Christ, actually mined this rich seam of theology that we see in Isaiah, particularly in the chapters that we're going to be listening to in this next week. I think that one thing I'd encourage everyone to consider when they listen to these verses and chapters in the next week is that scholars generally think that this next section that we're going to be listening to was actually written about 120 years after the two sections that we've been listening to thus far. So this actual third section of Isaiah we're listening to actually was written 120 years after the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, were actually conquered by the Babylonians and carried off into exile. And that will give us a slightly different perspective on what that might sound like to our ears. And also, some of you may be wondering, well, how on earth did that happen? How did Isaiah, who was reportedly living 150 years before this in 720, how was it that he wrote? Well, scholars think generally that this would have been written by disciples of Isaiah and included in this canon of 3 books that we call Isaiah. So that's something to consider as you listen to the next section.
Yes, so we'll listen to chapters 50 to 66, the last bit of Isaiah, and alongside those as well, we're going to listen to some of the Psalms. Psalms 79 to 89. Now, taken together, that seems like a bit of a mishmash, but actually I think it's quite a good compilation of things together that Israel would have sort of repeated to itself and immersed itself in, especially during difficult times. They're reminders of God's character. They're reminders of how they were going to seek guidance from God, and they were reminders of the hope that they had, that there was rescue that they could expect from trouble, and big hope for the future, a way of life that they could look forward to, and a way of life that we can share in as well.
We hope you enjoy that, and we look forward to joining you next week.
Bye.